Most people show too early. Here's why I build first and why it compounds. My name is Fari and I build backend systems, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why I'm obsessed with building before showing, how I'm thinking about this, and how I am actively implementing this inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend infrastructure. So like always, I've noticed something about myself, over the past years, which is that I love building more than I love showing. Basically, focusing more on the actual craft and, love for the game, if you say, rather than just flaunting and saying, hey, this is what I've built and I want to, flex on everyone or anything like that. I think this approach has ultimately been my North Star for a pretty long time, because I've noticed that this is not solely just because I'm secretive, but because I've been compounding, building that compounding power of layered systems and making sure that these systems are intentional. Building these layered and intentional systems has always been my mode, especially for building, because I think one of the most important things, especially when you're building, is focusing on creating leverage. And how do you create leverage if you're just posting every single thing that you're actively doing? I think it may, be of service, in the beginning when you're trying to show people what you're actively building. But I think for me, I'm just one of those people that just loves the game too much, and I rather build and then show rather than showing and then continue building. And I think this has been, my North Star for such a long time, and that's why I'm very hesitant, to show what it is that I'm actively building on a day-to-day basis, because I think, that also keeps some of our, intentional, systems that we're building on the back end, rather than just making them the forefront of what it is that we're actively doing. Because making sure that our clients know that we're the real deal is most important, and making sure that we're just providing as much value on the back end, not focusing too much on showing that, basically flaunting that too much on the front end. Because early on in my journey, I would rush to show results. I'd basically show every single thing that, hey, I'm building this, I'm building that. And of course, when you're first starting out, you get that excitement of saying, hey, I'm building out, this specific workflow, or I'm building out this. 100%, it shows what it is that you're building. But thinking, ultimately, that thinking ultimately led me to think that, this, what I'm posting, is ultimately leading to value. And that is not the truth. At least that is what I've, ultimately been able to gather as I just, get more skin in the game, if you will. Because, yeah, sometimes it absolutely does. You think that you're building and you're showing all these results and that equates to value. And for me, I've realized that one of the most important things is that value needs to be, carefully, shown, not just, show every single thing that you're building on a day-to-day basis, because you ultimately also need to have leverage. And this is what I've been able to learn as well, because if the foundations aren't strong in terms of what we're able to build, then the visibility just amplifies the flaws that we have. And I think this is such an important concept to keep in mind in terms of, for these daily videos. The reason why I started in the beginning was because I wanted to get a lot better, at speaking in front of the camera and just, pressing record and just 10xing my, execution in terms of what I'm doing. And ultimately that, amplify the flaws, that I was not as good, at speaking in the way that I am today. But ultimately through that has ultimately turned me into a sharper builder. And I think it's also the same case, especially when we're building systems, because now I focus a lot more on the layers that ultimately are behind the outcome. And what I mean by this is, it means that I'm focusing on the processes that make each build faster and cleaner next time. Because if we're able to, slow down or or ultimately, reduce the time that we ultimately are able to ship, and just ship a lot faster, and ultimately, use that to make cleaner builds the next time, I think that is how we're able to, think about this, by basically being able to layer it up in different, outcomes, to say, hey, we're layering this in this specific way. And before we even show, what it is that we're building, we need to make sure that we have the foundations to be as solid as possible. Because if the foundations are weak, then ultimately it's going to ultimately just amplify the flaws that we have. And one of the most important things is that we don't want to, amplify the flaws, in more than they have to. But ultimately we understand that, in order to build real, raw, and authentic, we also need to make sure that we're showing some of the builds that we're actively doing, but also just, not showing too much, because you don't want to dox, the people that we're actively working with and partnering up with. I think that is also, super important to have that confidentiality, because if you're just blasting, hey, I'm working with XYZ, I'm working, doing all this stuff, I think ultimately that loses a lot of trust, because you just don't earn to be in that room anymore. I think discretion is one of the most important modes as well around that, and layering that as well, but ultimately understanding that also as well with this, the systems that let the value compound quietly is ultimately another layer. Basically, being able to say that what we're actively building needs to be able to compound quietly, and it doesn't always need to be loud. It needs to be one of those things that if you know the real leverage, and also understanding that what we're building is not going to be for everyone. Not everyone's going to be able to understand it, but the people that do get it, they're ultimately going to know the leverage that this ultimately has within their business. And we want to own the infrastructure layer in terms of backend systems, and I know that we're gonna just run with it by building these modes of Killer Chaos OS, just understanding where we're making mistakes, and also just showing what it is that we need to show, but not showing every single intricate detail. I think that is ultimately what we need to focus a lot more going into the future, like I've always been focusing on, but I think just taking it to a whole new level. And I think also layering this as well with the state of my thinking, I think this is one of the most important modes as well, and one of the things that I have been driving a lot more within these videos, just basically showing the thinking OS. I know in the beginning when I first started making these videos, the main mission was ultimately to have those feedback loops, also to build those mental models and frameworks, because I know that those mental models and frameworks are ultimately going to scale into the future, and they're also going to work as a training tool, if you will, for future talent that does come within the team as well into the future, and saying, hey, we're actively documenting my thinking, basically my OS, how I make decisions, how I'm able to solve problems, because I think that is one of the most important modes right now that we need to make sure that we're just building the foundation and we're making it solid, making sure that the problem solving is on point. And how do we actively think about this? I think first principles is one of the most important modes, because I'm such a big believer in first principles, basically asking why 5 times and getting to the root of what it is that we're actively doing. I think this is a truth that I've been carrying with me for such a long time, and also bundling that with systems thinking as well, basically understanding how different flows and stocks basically work, I think is ultimately the mode that ultimately drives my thinking OS. Understanding that there are feedback loops as well that ultimately governs how things flow, and also as well there are also feedback loops that are also governing a lot of things in the real world. Understanding that most things are interconnected in some shape or form, and how do we understand this interconnection from a root perspective, because that ultimately allows us to then reason up and then ultimately understand how the system will function as a whole. So this ultimately is the way that I like to think about things, and also bundling that up with my energy. Basically, I'm just super pumped to be building each and every single day. I think that into the future, my energy is ultimately going to be what drives Killer Chaos OS forward, and I'm super aware of this, because if I'm able to be the most enthusiastic, the most passionate in terms of what it is that we're building, and just waking up each and every single day and just being so confident and so excited and motivated in order to understand that we're building the vision of Killer Chaos OS, we may get things wrong. And like I mentioned in my previous video, that the mission over ego is one of the most important sources of truth that I'm now taking with me, to say that, hey, the main mission is to drive back in ops for a lot further than it is right now. And how are we able to do that? We're building Killer Chaos OS to be somewhat of a catalyst in order to build the next generation of back-end infrastructure for businesses, because with all that's going on with the rise of AI and all these different things that are coming to play, I think complexity is ultimately going to increase. And with that increase in complexity, I know there's a lot of value that Killer Chaos Chaos OS will be able to bring inside businesses, and how do we, think about, scaling that into the future. And that's why I think, it's super important to have these decision OSs, these different ways of that, we're basically documenting this, because I know that into the future, the way that we're speaking about it now is gonna hopefully stay consistent. And I know that the more that we're able to just build on the back end and then show results as we need to, the more we're gonna create a lot of leverage. And also understanding that I am building this way because every time I show something, I want it to be high leverage. I don't want to just show something and then it's like, hey, like someone else can do it. I want to make sure that when we show something, that it is ultimately the highest leverage, that we can ultimately show in that point in time, and ultimately creates value. Because understanding that, the way that we're thinking about creating value and the value loops that we're also, building on the internal side is ultimately going to govern how we're going to be able to build Killer Chaos OS into the future. I think we need to make sure that we have a solid foundation before we start building up from there. And how do we actively do this? We ultimately just make sure that we're logging the decisions that we're making, sharpening the, the OS, the operating system. And like always, I like to mention that each and every single video that I like to think of things as different operating systems that, are governed by certain factors, and understanding that, if someone is engaging with my work, I don't just want them to see the final product. I want them to see the years of systems learning and also the iterations baked in. And I think this is one of the most important things. If you're able to basically craft, this vision where you're able to show that, hey, this is not just a final version. This shows, the years that we've spent in terms of, building this Killer Chaos OS, how we've been able to create the leverage, that we've ultimately been able to create, and also the learnings, basically the good, the bad, the ugly, what we've been able to learn, throughout this entire process, and, also the foundations, because I think that is ultimately going to create a lot more value than rather than just showing, hey, this is the final product, but showing the story and the journey and the documentation as well, all baked into one. I think is ultimately going to make sure that when we show what it is that we're actively showing in that point in time, it's only going to scale the value or the perceived value that we're showing in that point in time. And how do we create leverage? I think leverage ultimately comes from, thinking about things in a certain way, like we are right now, and ultimately understanding that, hey, we'll get some things wrong, but ultimately the things that we're ultimately going to get right, we're going to run with it and make sure that we are scaling that into the future. And as well as, the iterations, I like to say iterations or innovation is the key, to ultimately, unlock a new realm of reality, because iteration is the key to innovation. Like I always like to say, it's even on my YouTube banner that iteration is the key to innovation, because the more we can iterate and rapidly, I think that is ultimately gonna, unlock a lot of new things and the way that we're gonna be thinking about things into the future. And how can we actively scale this? I know that we can focus on three things, which is making sure that we are building first and showing later. And what I mean by this is making sure that, we're iterating without pressure, making sure that the pressure that we're focusing on is only internal, like, having that rapid iteration cycles, saying, hey, we need to get this, instead of 6 months, let's shorten it to 2 months. How can we solve that in, basically compressing the time it takes in order to build this, and just have that level of intensity, but not in the sense of making it so public that ultimately if we're pushing so much towards a goal, but ultimately that gets us lost in terms of our vision. Just basically striking that balance, I think right now will be super key to making sure that we're building in public, but also making sure that we are putting pressure on ourselves, but not the external public pressure. Just making sure that we're focusing on what we need to focus in this present moment in time. This will ultimately change into the future. We could say, hey, we want to focus on, creating more pressure when we're scaled up. Say, hey, we have 50 people on the team, then ultimately we can just change it and say that we're going to start, being more public in terms of, the pressure of what it is that we're building, and making sure that we're ensuring that what I release is ultimately valuable and not just flashy. I think this is one of the most important things. I want to make sure that what it is that I'm actively showing in that present moment in time is not just flashy, it is ultimately valuable. If someone, say, hey, someone that I look up to, ultimately sees my work, I want to make sure that they're seeing the most valuable, thing that they possibly can that is coming from me. most valuable product or most valuable insights as well, making sure that we're just basically showing the most valuable thing that we can show in that present moment in time, and not focusing on flash. And I think quality and making sure that what it is that we're showing is the highest quality in that present moment in time is ultimately something that we're going to take to be a source of truth into the future, and understanding that this is going to compound over time, but ultimately building the foundation that ultimately allows me to be able to scale on. If we're able to build the vision of Killer Chaos OS, we need to make sure that we're building the compounding, positive compounding loops that ultimately, service us, in terms of when we get to scale. And I think that into the future, this is going to be so, so important, because if we don't get the foundations right and we scale, everything is going to be broken. And we want to make sure that we don't want to get to that point, that we're building right and making sure that each and every single day we're creating as much value as we possibly can, but also understanding that we are building first, number one, and then showing what it is that we're building first, and then ultimately showing what it is that we're building, but ultimately doing it in a way that ultimately creates leverage and is the highest valuable proposition, or the most valuable product that we can show in that present moment in time. And also for me, understanding that the obsession is super simple. The deeper I build before showing, the bigger the impact when I do. Because I think that for me, one of the most important things that has changed my narrative is ultimately building first and then showing. Just saying, hey, this is what we're actively building. Like with these videos, we've been doing 97 days, just constantly just building, but not really gone into the intricate details of what it is that we've actively been able to build in terms of this second ops brain, or what is inside Killer Chaos OS. Because I think that the impact when we do show what it is that we have been building and are still building, I think it's going to be a lot higher than it is if we just sort of went from the jump and said, hey, we're building this, and then showing every single intricate detail and doxing and all these things. I think it wouldn't be as valuable as it possibly can, because now we're layering in the storytelling aspect of it to say, hey, we start from day zero and now here we are, and we've been perfecting in terms of our thinking and also our decision making, things that we've gotten wrong and things that we've gotten right as well. And ultimately understanding that this is not just a one and done type of thing, and focusing that, hey, this is the system that I trust, and that's the approach that wins over time. I know that this is the way that I'm actively thinking about this in today. This may change into the future. Like I said, we're going to get some things wrong and we're going to get some things right, but the things that we do get right, I know we're going to run with it, and we're ultimately going to build and scale with Killer Chaos OS. I know we're still a long way from the grand vision of Killer Chaos OS, but I know with these daily videos we're going to get one step closer each and every single day. And for me, I cannot wait. It's no more exciting feeling than waking up each and every single day and just being excited to build Killer Chaos OS, because I know the insane amounts of value that we're going to be building, like I said, into the future. With all this complexity that is rising, businesses are going to see a lot of value within Killer Chaos OS. And hey, maybe we may be wrong, but ultimately we're going to contribute towards building that infrastructure layer. Like I said, mission over ego, that ultimately scales the level of impact that backend operations has, and not just for today but also into the future, where we have the grand vision of Killer Chaos OS, where we ultimately have $100 million worth of impact, the arbitrary number, and inspiring millions of people, but most importantly also reshaping or redefining industries, which is the ultimate goal. But number one out of all of them is ultimately making sure that we're just pushing the needle forward and focusing on the mission of Killer Chaos OS, and taking one step closer each and every single day. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to follow me or just connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.